Hello, everyone, and welcome to PCR's September Tips and Virtual Transition Times meeting. My name is Melissa Wyman, and I am PCR's Respite Care and Community Engagement Director. I will be your moderator this evening, so please feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat box below. We are so excited to be collaborating with Montgomery County Public Schools, MCPS Transition Services Unit, to provide an enhanced transition times program for transitioning youth, their family, and caregivers. We are delighted to offer this presentation with American Sign Language simultaneous interpretation. We will also be offering this presentation with Spanish simultaneous interpretation. To access the other interpretation services, at the bottom of your screen, select Interpretation, select Spanish, mute original audio if you only want to hear one language. The English and Spanish versions will be archived on the PCR website Transition Times page. Just some Zoom tip reminders. We are using the webinar platform. We will wait for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit any of your questions in the chat box below. Click Show Captions to see the captions for the webinar. You must select the speaking language you would like to show. Also, for funding needs, it's very important to receive feedback from our attendees. Please answer the poll by the end of the webinar. Thank you for your help and feedback. So tonight we are so excited to have Michael Dalto from High Note Consulting LLC. Michael has become our favorite SSI, SSDI guru around the Montgomery County, and we love having him and so excited to have him back for a full 2 hours. So Michael?
Thank you very much, Melissa. So, in a small village in Ireland lived a very mean, nasty, ungrateful old man. And one day he finally died, and the entire village turned out for his funeral, not because any of them liked him, but because they wanted to see what the priest would say in his eulogy. And so the entire church was filled. Every pew had standing room only. And the priest stepped up to the pulpit, took a deep sigh, and said, "Well, his brother was worse." And I can tell you, applying for SSI or SSDI benefits is no one's idea of a good time, but it could be worse. And the goal of tonight's presentation is to help you learn how to possibly speed up the process somewhat, and most importantly, to greatly increase the chances that your application can be approved on the first try, ideally without an appeal. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with some information about SSI and SSDI, who's eligible for each, how much you can get, the differences between them, before we get into the actual application process. So first off, the terms SSI and SSDI highlight one of the cardinal rules for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public, and that is give very different benefits, very similar names. SSI and SSDI differ by only one letter, but they're very different benefits, although they do have some similarities. Starting with SSI, which stands for Supplemental Security Income. It is a cash benefit that people can get from Social Security if they have a disability or they're at least 65 years old, even if they're not disabled. But for our purposes, I think everybody you may be participating in this webinar on behalf of probably has a disability. And the person has to have not much money. They have to have low income and low resources. Resources are assets. Talk about the difference between those momentarily. So You get a cash benefit based on disability or being at least 65 and not having much money. That's SSI. Next slide, please. SSDI stands for Social Security Disability Insurance. Like SSI, it is also a cash benefit that people get from Social Security. Like SSI, you have to have a disability to qualify. Unlike SSI, you can't get it if you're old and don't have a disability. But that's where the similarities end. SSDI is not based on financial need like SSI is. It's based on the individual, or in some cases, a parent of an individual with a disability, having worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings long enough to have something called insured status. So when you work and you pay Social Security taxes on your earnings, if you're on a payroll, those Social Security taxes are taken out. It's usually called FICA, F-I-C-A. And paying your Social Security taxes is kind of like paying your insurance premiums. If you pay enough for a long enough period, you're insured, and then the individual can qualify for benefits. Next slide. So who's eligible for SSI? It can be a person with a disability of any age, or a person who's 65 or older, whether or not they have a disability. They have to be a US citizen or a legally admitted non-citizen who meets certain requirements, and there are a fair number of requirements for non-citizens, and have income and resources below certain limits. Next slide. Who's eligible for SSDI? A person who's disabled, who has worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings long enough to have insured status, or, next slide, or they have a parent who has worked and acquired insured status, and they can get a benefit, an SSDI benefit, on the parent's record if they meet the following conditions. The person with a disability must be an adult, at least 18 years old. Their disability had to start before age 22. And they have to have a parent who is either getting Social Security retirement benefits or SSDI, or the parent must be deceased. So to get those benefits, the parent must have worked long enough to have that insured status. Now, the kind of SSDI that's based on a parent's work record is generally called a disabled adult child, DAC or DAC for short, which is the old name for it, but it's still used by most people. Or the new name is Childhood Disability Benefit, CDB for short. Next slide. So how disabled does a person need to be to qualify for SSI or SSDI? Starting with an adult has to have a severe disability that's lasted or is expected to last at least a year, or it's a terminal illness. And for an adult, 18 or older, their disability has to limit their ability to work. It has to specifically prevent them from doing substantial work. Social Security calls that substantial gainful activity, or SGA for short. And SGA is marked by a level of earnings but not just a level of earnings. Don't really have time to go into the intricacies of substantial gainful activity. But if a person is earning less than $1,620 a month, it's safe to say they're not doing substantial work using Social Security's definition. If the person is blind, there's a higher earnings level. If they're earning less than $2,700 a month, then it's safe to say they're not doing substantial work. However, sometimes earnings may be greater than $1,620 a month or $2,700 a month for a blind person, and they may still not be doing substantial work. There's certain subtractions from earnings that are allowed. And when I say $1,620 a month or $2,700 a month earnings, that means before tax earnings, such as gross wages. Next slide, please. So a blind person is not subject to the substantial work test when they apply for SSI, but they are subject to it if they apply for SSDI. And Social Security's definition of blindness is that the person's vision in their better eye with correction with lenses is no better than 20 over 200, or their field of vision is no greater than 20 degrees. Next slide. So I mentioned that SSI is a benefit based on financial need. There's a limit on income and a limit on resources. First of all, what's the difference between income and resources? I have a trainer friend who likes to say, income is what you get and resources are what you got. So if you receive money during a calendar month, that's income. And the amount of it that counts will count against the income limit for SSI. If you have any of that income left over at the end of the month that you haven't spent or converted to a type that doesn't count, then as of the first day of the next month, that carryover amount becomes a resource. It's subject to the resource limit, which is different from the income limit, and it remains a resource as long as you have it. So money is income in the month you receive it, and any that's left over the next month and future months becomes a resource. So what's the income limit for SSI? That depends on the type of income the person has. So suppose the person has only so-called unearned income, such as Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, or pensions, annuities, interest, dividends, unemployment benefits, workers' compensation benefits, etc. If they have only so-called unearned income, their income must usually be less than $987 a month this year in 2025. Now, if the person has only earned income, like wages, self-employment income, tips, uh, salaries, etc., maybe commissions if they're a salesperson. If they have only earned income, which would be money paid to them as direct compensation for work they did, then after they've applied and been found eligible, then at that point, their earnings usually have to be under $2,019 a month this year in order to remain eligible for at least a little bit of SSI. Next slide, please. So what's the resource limit? Remember, resources are what you got. This would be the amount left over in the month after receiving income. The resource limit for SSI is only $2,000, which really stinks. But fortunately, not every kind of resource counts against that $2,000 limit, but many resources do, including cash, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, CDs, other kinds of investments, the cash surrender value of a whole life insurance policy, retirement accounts, real estate, other than the home the person lives in, and some others. So those all count against the $2,000 resource limit. But there's some very important types of resources that don't count against that limit. The home the person lives in, even if it's worth $1 million and they own it free and clear with no mortgage, as long as they live in it, does not count against the $2,000 limit. Neither does one motor vehicle they own. So it's nice to know that you can own a home and a car and still be eligible for SSI. Life insurance that has no cash surrender value, usually called term insurance, doesn't count against that limit. Certain burial funds, special needs trusts, if you're not familiar with these, they're special accounts that are set up to benefit a person with a disability. Most commonly, maybe if a family member wants to leave money in their will to a relative who gets SSI, but doesn't want to jeopardize their SSI, they can set up a trust. The money that goes into the trust belongs to the trust, not to the person with a disability. And the person with a disability has no control over the money. Another person called the trustee, who could be a family member, an attorney, a financial planner. That's the only person who can manage the money in the trust and withdraw money. But the trustee is only allowed to withdraw money from the trust to spend on expenses to benefit the person with the disability. So it's a way that a person with a disability can benefit from money, oftentimes a large amount of money. There's no limit on how much can be placed in a special needs trust, but it won't count as a resource and won't affect their SSI. Property that's used for a job or business does not count against that resource limit. And finally, my favorite, up to $100,000 saved in an ABLE account. An ABLE account is an account that's owned by a person with a disability. In Maryland, you can open an ABLE account at Maryland Able, Maryland all spelled out, Able, ABLE.org. And that account is owned by the person with a disability. Anyone can contribute money to it, the person with a disability, family, friends, agencies, even strangers, potentially. But there's a limit generally of $19,000 a year this year on total contributions from all contributors to an ABLE account. Though if that limit is reached and the person with a disability who owns the account is working for pay and does not have a retirement account, they're allowed to contribute extra, up to about $15,000 a year extra to that account from their own income. There are tax advantages to ABLE accounts. And once the money is in the account, it can be withdrawn to spend on a wide variety of expenses, ordinary living expenses like housing, food, clothing, transportation, health and wellness, employment training and support, assistive technology, and lots of others. So it's a great way for a person with a disability to be able to save money, substantially more than $2,000, and still be eligible for SSI. Next slide, please. So what's the maximum SSI benefit? In the state of Maryland, it's $967 a month for an unmarried individual in 2025. Now, most couples, if both members receive SSI, choose to live together without marrying because there's a substantial penalty if they get married. Two individuals who get SSI, each receiving $967 a month, if they marry and live together, will only get $1,450 a month combined between them, which is only 1.5 times the benefit that an individual could get. So they could lose a lot of money through marriage. Now, a person generally needs to be paying at least $342.33 a month for their housing in 2025 to qualify for up to the full amount of SSI. If they don't pay anything for housing, the most SSI they can get is only 2/3 of that full amount, or $644.67 a month. And where does the $342.33 a month come from? It is 1/3 of the maximum SSI benefit plus $20. So that amount will go up, the required minimum to pay for housing to get the full SSI benefit will go up in January, generally goes up January of each year when the SSI benefit is increased. Now, SSI is a benefit based on financial need. So when a person has other income, generally that will reduce the amount of SSI they can get. But fortunately, if they have income from work, that income will reduce their SSI by less than half the amount of their work income, which means that although their SSI will be reduced, their net income will be higher because they'll be getting more money in their earnings from work than they'll be losing in SSI. Next slide. So a person who gets SSI in the state of Maryland is automatically and immediately eligible for a medical benefit called Medicaid. And in the state of Maryland, we also call Medicaid medical assistance. This is another rule for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public. Give some benefits more than one name. That keeps everyone off balance. So Medicaid equals medical assistance in the state of Maryland. And that benefit covers most medical expenses that you would expect health insurance to cover. There are no copays except for prescriptions, very affordable. It can be a challenge to find healthcare providers who accept medical assistance. But in my experience, every pharmacy and hospital accepts medical assistance, and many other healthcare providers, but not as many as accept Medicare or private health insurance generally. Medical assistance is also helpful because it pays for certain disability-related services that other insurance will rarely, if ever, cover adequately, like attendance services, psychiatric rehabilitation services in the community, um, services from the Developmental Disabilities Administration, DDA, for example, and even it qualifies a person through the local health department to get free transportation to and from services covered by Medicaid. Next slide, please. Now, if a person has other insurance like private insurance or Medicare, their medical assistance can supplement that other insurance. If they have private insurance, the medical assistance may cover some services that their private insurance does not. And it may fill in a gap sometimes. For example, if there are limits on how much coverage for a particular service private insurance will provide, if that limit is reached, oftentimes medical assistance can kick in at that point and cover more of that service. If a person gets medical assistance and Medicare, they get a huge benefit. Medicare usually entails out-of-pocket costs, premiums, deductibles, co-insurance. If the person gets medical assistance in Maryland and they have Medicare, the medical assistance will wipe out virtually all of their out-of-pocket costs for Medicare. And a person qualifies for medical assistance automatically in the state of Maryland if they have any amount of SSI from the minimum $1 a month to the maximum $967 a month or anything in between. Next slide, please. Now let's switch over to SSDI. So what is the income limit for SSDI? Well, there is no limit on so-called unearned income for SSDI. Remember, SSDI is not a benefit based on financial need. So it's different from SSI. It's an insurance program. It's based on the individual or their parent having worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings, which is like paying insurance premiums. Now, earnings have to be below the substantial work level for a person to initially qualify for SSDI. And you can refer back to slide 7 for a bit more information about that. But there are safety nets called work incentives that can enable a person to earn more than the substantial work level, which was $1,620 a month before tax earnings if the person is not blind, and $2,700 a month if the person is blind. If they're earning more than that amount, they may still be considered to not be doing substantial work and to still be eligible to apply for SSDI if they can use these safety nets called work incentives. For example, a person who's working for wages is allowed to deduct expenses that they pay for out of their pocket that are needed because of their disability and needed at least partly for work. Also, if they're paid the full wage for their job, but their productivity is lower than a typical non-disabled worker doing the same job because of their disability, such as if they work more slowly or there's certain duties they can't fully perform because of a disability, or they get extra help from someone to get their job done. There's a subtraction for that. And if the remaining amount of their earnings after the subtractions is below $1,620 a month if they're not blind, or below $2,700 a month if they are blind, then they will be found to not be doing substantial work, and they can still be eligible for SSDI. Next slide, please. So there is no limit on resources for SSDI. So there's no limit on unearned income, no limit on resources for SSDI. And the person's earned income, their income from work, just needs to be below the substantial work level for them to be eligible for SSDI. Next slide. What's the maximum SSDI benefit? It's surprisingly high. It's a little over $4,000 a month. But to qualify for that much, a person generally would need to have earned a six-figure salary for a number of years. The average SSDI benefit this year is $1,580 a month. And because that's the average, there are many people who receive less than that. There are some people receiving less than $200 a month of SSDI. It depends on the average lifetime earnings of the person with a disability or their parent on whose record they're receiving the benefit. So the higher the person's average lifetime earnings, the higher their SSDI will be, up to the maximum 4,018 a month. And the lower their average earnings, the lower their benefit will be. But the average is $1,580 a month, which is substantially more than the maximum SSI benefit for an individual, which remember was $967 a month. So on average, SSDI pays more than SSI. There's another big difference between SSI and SSDI. SSI benefits can fluctuate up or down according to other income. The more other income a person gets, generally the less SSI they'll receive. SSDI, on the other hand, is an all or nothing benefit. The person receives the full amount, or if their earnings are over the substantial level for a certain period of time, they would receive 0 SSDI. Next slide. And SSDI comes along with a medical benefit, but it's a different benefit than SSI provides. SSI provides Medicaid, also known as medical assistance. SSDI provides Medicare, but only after a waiting period. Person has to be entitled to SSDI for 2 years before their Medicare will start. Next slide. Okay, that's our introduction to both benefits. Now let's get into the application process. So how does a person apply for SSI or SSDI? They have 2 options. They or someone acting on their behalf can call Social Security's toll-free number to make an appointment to apply for benefits over the phone with a representative. Generally, they're not taking in-person appointments for applying for these benefits at this point. Or you can apply online for SSDI using the link about 2/3 of the way down slide 18. But before you can apply for SSDI online, you have to open something called a My Social Security account, which you can do using the link at the bottom of slide 18. Now, most people can apply for SSI online as well, though there are some restrictions, and we'll find those on the next slide, please. So a person can apply online for SSI if they're 18 to 64 years old, they have never been married, they're not blind, they're a US citizen living in one of the states or DC or the Northern Mariana Islands. They have not applied for or received SSI in the past, and they're applying for SSDI at the same time that they apply for SSI. That's actually automatic. If a person applies for SSI, it's considered a benefit of last resort, and Social Security always checks to see if the person would be eligible for SSDI before they process the SSI application. And to apply for SSI online, using the link at the top of slide 19, the person also must open a My Social Security account. And it's the same link that was at the bottom of slide 18, and it's found at the bottom of slide 19. Next slide, please. So what information will you need to apply for SSI or SSDI? Well, there are some documents you'll need to have available. You can find a list of them at the top of slide 20. There's a link to a list of documents you'll need. And for SSDI, the second link on slide 20 provides the information needed to apply for SSDI. Next slide. Now, there are specific forms that are completed with the SSI and SSDI applications. If you apply online, all of the questions will be drawn from these forms. If you apply over the phone, the questions you'll be asked will come directly from these forms. So by downloading these forms online, you can look in advance and find out which questions you'll be asked and be prepared. So there's an SSI application. That's the SSA 8000 form. You can get that at the first link on slide 21. The SSDI application, form number SSA 16, is the second link on that same slide. And the application for the Childhood Disability Benefit, also known as Disabled Adult Child Benefit, that's the form of SSDI that a person gets on a parent's work record, is the SSA 4 form. And you can get that the third link on slide 21. Next slide, please. There's also a disability report adult form, the SSA 3368, that's used for both SSI and SSDI applications. That's the one that asks lots of questions about the person's disability, their diagnosis, how their disability limits their activities, medical services they've received, etc. And there's an authorization to release information. And that's a form that gives Social Security or gives permission, the individual's permission to healthcare providers to provide medical records to Social Security to document the person's disability. And so you can find each of these forms at the link provided. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you some tips about how to get SSI and SSDI approved and possibly a bit more quickly. Before I give you these tips, however, I need to warn you that even if you can speed up the process a bit, it's going to be a lengthy process. It can take many months, sometimes over a year, to get the initial decision on an SSI or SSDI application. The wait time didn't used to be that long, but ever since COVID, they've been backed up, and it can take quite a while. But there are ways that you can speed things up a bit. So one thing you can do is to apply for benefits as soon as the person may be eligible. When we're talking about SSI, most children under the age of 18 are not eligible for SSI because of their parents' money. If a child under 18 lives with one or both parents, and the parents have money and they're not eligible for SSI, a portion of the parents' income and resources is counted as if it belonged to the child. And that will, in many cases, most cases, make the child financially ineligible, not eligible for SSI. But once the child turns 18, becomes an adult, only their own income and resources count, not their parents' money. So if your child is not eligible now, that they're under age 18 for SSI, when they turn 18, one birthday gift you can give them is an application for SSI. At that point, they will likely be eligible. Now, if a parent of a son or daughter with a disability files for Social Security retirement or for SSDI, or if the parent who has a work history passes away, that's the time to go ahead and apply for the SSDI based on the parent's record. That's again called Disabled Adult Child, DAC, or alternatively, Childhood Disability Benefit, CDB. When the parent applies for Social Security retirement or SSDI, they should indicate that they have a disabled child so that Social Security knows that that child may be eligible for a benefit on their work record. Next slide. Probably the best thing you can do to speed up the process of applying for SSI or SSDI is to get copies of medical records that verify a person's disability. So that could be psychological evaluations, psychiatric evaluations, medical evaluations for other disabilities, say maybe from a neurologist if a person has a seizure disorder, or an ophthalmologist or optometrist if they have a vision impairment, etc. School records, especially IEPs, Section 504 plans, can help. And if you ask Social Security, do I need to get medical records and provide those to you? They will likely say, oh, no, you don't have to do that, because one of the forms that you're signing or the applicant is signing is a consent for release of information that gives Social Security authorization to receive records from doctors, other healthcare providers, schools, etc. The problem is, if Social Security requests those records, it can often delay the process by months. So you probably, if you're on this webinar, you probably already have a stack of these documents. And the most recent ones are the most important. But if you have some older documents that show that a disability is long-standing. It wouldn't hurt to include some of those as well. So getting those medical and school records together and submitting them with the SSI or SSDI application can help. Also, if the applicant has done any kind of work, and specifically if they're an adult, 18 or older, if somebody who was familiar with their work, the employer, maybe if the work was through school, maybe a school counselor, a job coach if they had one, um, perhaps a coworker, if they can write up a brief narrative about how the person's disability limited their effectiveness in the job, their ability to do the tasks, that can really help get an application approved. Next slide, please. So when you're completing the application, specifically, especially the disability report form, you want to play the deficit game. With your son or daughter, generally you want to do the opposite. Obviously, you want to focus on their strengths, their abilities. But when you're applying for these benefits, you have to focus on their limitations, how their disability limits their activities, especially activities that are usually involved in work, like standing, walking, lifting, handling, seeing, hearing, speaking, and understanding and following instructions. There's one question in the disability report that asks about the person's daily activities from when they wake up in the morning until they go to bed at night. To answer that question, you don't want to simply say, she gets up, she has breakfast, she goes to school, she comes home, she does her homework, she watches TV, she gets ready for bed, because that would describe any person, any student's routine. You want to emphasize how the disability limits those activities. For example, she has difficulty waking up in the morning because her medication makes her groggy. She can pour dry cereal in a bowl, but she can't pour milk in the bowl due to poor manual dexterity. She is unable to use standard public transportation because of an intellectual disability. So she must be driven everywhere, etc. Next slide, please. So I already mentioned this one. If the person's done any kind of paid or unpaid work, if you can get someone who is familiar with their work to write up a narrative about how the disability limited their work activities, that can help a great deal. For an adult who's applying for SSI or SSDI, their disability has to be considered to limit their ability to work, not to prevent them from working at all, but to limit their workability. Now, if they have no work history at all, then it's really just a guessing game on Social Security's part whether the person's disability really limits their ability to work. If they've done some work and they've got a narrative for an employer, a job coach, etc., explaining exactly how their disability limited their work, that makes it easier for Social Security to approve the application. Next slide. A few obvious common sense tips. If Social Security requests more information, which they frequently do, obviously you want to provide it as quickly as possible. Next slide. If they schedule an appointment for a medical evaluation, You want to keep the appointment. And if you're unable to keep the appointment as scheduled, let them know as quickly as possible. The best way to delay an application is by missing one of those appointments without giving notice. That will put you back down at the bottom of the heap. When would they schedule a medical evaluation? If they determine that the medical records and school records that you've submitted were not sufficient to make a decision about the applicant's disability. So the best thing you can do, again, is to get good medical and school records. The medical records from your child's own healthcare providers will be best because their healthcare providers know them and have a relationship with them. If they have to go to one of these medical evaluations that Social Security schedules for them, it's pot luck. You don't know how good the evaluator will be. They might spend as little as 10 minutes with them. And obviously, they have no prior knowledge of the individual. So you may not be getting a high quality evaluation. And in my opinion, I think there's an inherent conflict of interest if an evaluator who is being paid by Social Security to do these evaluations is evaluating a person to see if they can qualify for SSI or SSDI. There's at least the appearance of a conflict of interest because if you're being paid by an agency to do an evaluation, you may lean in the direction of indicating that a person may not be eligible for benefits because it saves money for the agency that's paying you. That's my own personal opinion. Take that for what it's worth. Next slide, please. You want to keep copies of anything that you send to Social Security. And every time you send them anything, you want to request a receipt. They do lose things. If you get a receipt, then you have proof that not only you submitted the documents they need, but that they received them. So if they lose them, they claim they didn't receive them, you'll have proof that in fact they did. So keep copies and get receipts for everything you send to them. Next slide, please. And you want to keep everything they send you. And I mean everything. The IRS will tell you to keep your tax records for 7 years. I'll tell you, keep your SSI and SSDI records for a lot longer than that. I've known people who needed to go back to records from a couple of decades ago. So it's not a bad idea to have half a filing cabinet drawer reserved for SSI and SSDI documents. Next slide, please. Now, when a person applies for SSI or SSDI, their application goes to Social Security first. But Social Security is not doing all of the work involved in the application. They're only initially determining if the person is financially eligible for the benefit. Once they've determined that the person is financially eligible, they forward the application to a state agency called Disability Determination Services. That's DDS for short. They are paid by Social Security to evaluate each applicant's disability. That is the longest and most complicated part of the application process, and it's called a disability determination. So this state agency, DDS, uses Social Security's rules to evaluate each person's disability. Next slide, please. The disability determination process involves 5 steps. First step asks, is the person doing substantial work now? If they are, then they'll be denied at step 1, because part of the definition of disability for adults is you're unable to do substantial work. If you're already doing substantial work, by definition, you don't qualify. If you're not doing substantial work, then they move on to step 2, which asks, does the person have a severe disability? If not, they're denied. If so, you move on to step 3. Step 3 asks, does the person's disability meet or equal the criteria for a condition in the listing of impairments that Social Security has? And we're going to go into some details about that listing of impairments because it's available online. And if the disability meets those criteria, then the person should be approved at step 3. If not, then you move on to step 4. Next slide, please. Step 4 asks, can the person do any past work that they've done at the substantial level? If they can, they're denied. If they can't, then you go on to step 5, and step 5 asks, can the person do substantial work of any other kind? And if they can, they'll be denied. If they can't, they'll be approved. Step 3 is the quickest and easiest way to be approved if you can show that the person meets the criteria. Next slide. So the adult listing of impairments you can find at the link on slide 34. And we're going to look at what it looks like on the next few slides. Next slide, please. So when you go to that link and find the adult listing of impairments, you'll see a screen like this. It breaks down the body into the various body systems. And you'll try to identify the system that most closely matches your family member's disability. Let's say they have autism spectrum disorder. That's going to be under mental disorders in the lower right of the screen. When you click on that, you will come to, next slide, please. And then let's go one more slide, please. You'll come to a page that looks like this. Provides information about mental disorders. And on the left, it describes certain types of mental disorders. And you can click on the one that most closely matches your family member's disability. This is not all of them. Autism spectrum disorder, for example, is further down on the list. Next slide, please. If you click on autism spectrum disorder, this is what you get. It says that your autism diagnosis will match or will meet or equal the listing for autism spectrum disorder in the listing of impairments if the criteria are met that are spelled out here. Person has to meet under A, conditions 1 and 2, and under B, extreme limitation of 1 or marked limitation of 2 of 4 areas of mental functioning that are listed. You'll also see a number of blue links like 12.00 B8, 12.00F, etc. That drills down and provides deeper details about these things. So this is your best chance of getting approved more quickly than otherwise, if you can provide evidence that the disability meets the criteria. And you'll find similar sets of criteria for lots of other disabilities in the listing of impairments. Autism spectrum disorder is just one that I provided, for example. So what I recommend is that you contact your child's, your family members, psychologist, psychiatrist, neurologist, etc. They're doctors, healthcare providers. If necessary, provide them with a link to the listing of impairments for your family member's disability, or maybe copy the criteria and email them to the practitioner and ask them if they can be sure that their evaluation spells out how your family member meets the criteria. If they do, important to make clear that you're not asking them to falsify information, but you're asking them to indicate if they feel that your family member's disability meets the criteria, to make sure that their evaluation shows that. They may even want to use some of the same language that you'll find in the listing of impairments. That can make it a lot easier for disability determination services to find that your family member is disabled enough. Next slide. Okay. Now, if your family member does not meet all the criteria for any one disability, you still want to document all the criteria that they do meet. And if they have more than one disability, then go to the criteria for their other disabilities in the listing of impairments and document the criteria that they meet for those disabilities. Sometimes disability determination services can mix and match. They can take some criteria for one disability and some criteria for another disability, and the combination can qualify the person. Next slide. So if your family member does not meet enough of the criteria to be approved at step 3, if they don't have a disability or combination of disabilities that meets enough of the criteria in the listing of impairments, they can still be found disabled enough at steps 4 and 5, meaning they can't do past work or any other work at the substantial level. But that's when it's especially helpful to have a narrative of how any work experience they've done, how that went, and how their disability limited their work activities. Next slide, please. Now, after you apply, you want to periodically contact your local Social Security office to find out when they have finished their review and forwarded the application to Disability Determination Services, to DDS. And it says here it usually takes at least a few weeks. That's outdated information. It usually takes a few months at this point, but it's worth it to check in with them periodically. And if you're not sure where your local Social Security office is, you can find it using the link on slide 41. And if the phone number that's listed for your local Social Security office is not the actual phone number for that local office, if it's the national toll-free number, which is 800-772-1213, that's not the local office number, then you can Google your local Social Security office and you'll likely be able to find their actual local phone number. So once you've called the local Social Security office, probably repeatedly, and finally they've verified, yes, we finished our review, the application was forwarded to DDS, then, next slide, please. Then you can call DDS at 410-308-4350, verify they've received the application, and once they've assigned it to a worker called a disability examiner, then you can get the name and phone number of the disability examiner. And then you call the disability examiner and you act like you are their best friend. You are going to make their job easier. You want to verify that they have all the medical and school records that you provided. If they don't have everything, you can ask them how you can provide it to them, whether to mail it or fax it. Follow up with them, see if there's anything else they need, and try to make sure that they have enough information from you so they don't have to schedule a medical evaluation of their own for the reasons that we talked about earlier. Next slide. So, what happens if you go through all of these steps? Most likely what will happen is your family member will be approved. But if they're denied, you should always appeal. It says here, appeal within 60 days. More accurately, it's within 65 days of the date on the denial letter. And there's a form to use to appeal. The first level of appeal is called a request for reconsideration. And that form can be found at the link on this slide. If the application was denied for disability reasons, then when you appeal, try to get more records or better records to prove that the disability met Social Security's criteria. When you go through the first appeal, the request for reconsideration, the odds are not that high that you'll win at that level. So if you're denied again, you should appeal again. The second appeal, the third try, is usually the charm. More than half of people who are denied the first time will be approved the third try, the second appeal. Next slide. I think that may be it. Yes. Okay, and I believe we have time for some questions. Melissa? And I see there's lots of activity in the chat.
Okay,
Yes, there
Mr. Walt.
is.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions here. I've kind of consolidated a few of them. I started at the very beginning when you were talking about SSDI, kind of switched to SSI and then rounded it out. Most of the last questions are about the application process. So, question number one, how long does one need to work to have insured status? Is it 40 credits or more?
It's a great question. And thank you for sorting through all these questions, Patricia. That is a huge job. So it depends on the age of the applicant. So if the applicant is applying for SSDI based on their own work history, if they are over age 31, I'm going to oversimplify a little bit here. They generally have to have worked at least 5 out of the last 10 years, and they may have to have worked more than 5 years, depending on their age. At most, they would need 40 credits, which means they would need to have at least 10 years of work. But generally, they would need to have worked at least 5 out of the last 10 years as well. Now, if they're younger than age 31, they don't need as much work. And for example, if the person is under age 24, they only need 6 credits. They can get 6 credits by having worked only about a year and a half. So a person who's particularly young can qualify for SSDI without a whole lot of work history. But if you open a My Social Security account, one of the things you can get in that account online is a Social Security statement that will indicate about how much a person's SSDI benefit should be if they qualify now, based on earnings that Social Security is already aware of, although the person's most recent earnings may not be in there yet. So sometimes people are eligible, but the Social Security report doesn't show that yet. The My Social Security account also will show a person's earnings history. It'll show their annual earnings every year they've ever worked, their annual earnings, and Social Security is given that information by the IRS. And you can look and get an idea of whether the person may be eligible based on how many years they've worked. Okay.
Okay, next question. Does attending community college classes half-time or less count as substantial work?
It does not. Good question. Substantial work only means paid work. So it's work that for which a person gets compensation. Education itself would not be considered work for substantial work purposes.
Okay, there is a question about autism being a disabling condition, but I think you answered that. If somebody was receiving SSDI after approval USCIS, but lost it after the 7-year limit because immigration took longer than expected and currently has a green card, do they have to wait to become a US citizen to qualify again?
I'm not comfortable answering that question without a lot more detail
Right.
and having Social Security's rule book in front of me, because the criteria a person has to meet if they're not a US citizen in order to qualify for SSI are very complicated. So I apologize that I can't answer that question now. However, if the person could email that question, perhaps with more detail, to Melissa or Patricia, and then you can forward it to me. I can see if I can
Absolutely.
answer it,
Sure.
because I'm assuming that's not a hypothetical question.
I don't think the next one is either. If a young person is a US citizen, but the parent works at the World Bank and does not pay income tax, are they still eligible for SSDI?
To be eligible for SSDI, a person must be paying Social Security tax on their earnings.
Right.
If they are an employee, they're paid wages, or they get a W-2 at the end of the year. that the payroll tax usually will show up on the pay stub as an item called FICA, which stands for Federal Insurance Contributions Act. If they are self-employed, they don't have an employer to withhold Social Security taxes for them, they will typically pay self-employment tax. That's the way that they pay their Social Security tax. But if they are working and they are not paying Social Security tax on their earnings, they cannot be eligible for SSDI on their own record.
Okay, this is there any way the government will consider increasing the SSI asset limit of $2,000 that was set in 1989? An individual would like to petition and wonders where they could direct that petition.
Yeah, that's a great question. Fairly regularly, certain members of Congress will introduce bills to improve the SSI rules, always to increase the resource limit, generally to about $10,000 and maybe $15,000 for a married couple. Currently, the resource limit for a married couple is $3,000. They'll also petition to increase the maximum SSI payment and to make certain other improvements. Those bills never pass. They've never passed. What Social Security did as to sort of throw a bone, I think, to people receiving SSI and their advocates was to create the ABLE accounts that we talked about earlier that allow a person to save $100,000 and not have any of it count against the $2,000 resource limit for SSI. And there's an improvement coming to ABLE accounts on January 1st of 2026 that I should mention. Currently, to be eligible for an ABLE account, a person's disability had to start before their 26th birthday. As of January 2026, the person's disability only had to start before their 46th birthday. So people who became disabled somewhat later in life will be eligible for ABLE accounts come 2026. And we talked about some of the other types of resources that don't count against the $2,000 limit, like special needs trusts. But I'm afraid that we're going to be stuck with those loopholes. And I don't foresee Congress increasing the SSI resource limit anytime in the near future.
Is the transition, if a child receives SSI and is transitioning to SSDI, is that automatic or do they have to apply?
Another great question. I mentioned earlier that SSI is considered a benefit of last resort. To be eligible for it, a person has to agree to apply for and accept any other benefit they may be eligible for if Social Security directs them to apply for it, especially SSDI. However, Social Security is overwhelmed. They're not always going to be on top of whether a person on SSI may have become eligible for SSDI. And I recommend that if a person suspects they may have become eligible for SSDI, maybe because they've been doing paid work for a while, or they have a parent who recently started getting Social Security retirement or SSDI, or the parent passed away, that they contact Social Security to ask if they may be eligible for SSDI now. And if so, go ahead and apply.
Okay, the next one, and this is a question about receiving SSDI and a $2,000 asset limit, but that only applies to SSI, correct?
That's right. The
Okay.
$2,000 resource limit applies only to SSI. SSDI has no resource limit.
So then there are several questions about an adult child paying rent. And I'll just kind of consolidate them all. Can the parents charge the rent for a child who's over 18, living at home? And can they put that, in their process in applying for SSI? And can they use SSI funds to pay the rent?
Okay. This is a great question, and the answer is going to be relatively lengthy. Um, those of you who've been around the block for a while with SSI may recall that before September 30th of 2024, before just about a year ago, to be eligible for the maximum SSI benefit, a person had to be paying a market rate for their food and housing. And that created a problem for many people because in order to pay a market rate for food and housing, usually a person would have to pay more than the maximum SSI benefit. And that meant they were in kind of a catch-22. They couldn't afford to pay a market rate, and therefore their SSI would be reduced, generally by 1/3. As of September 30th of 2024, that rule was changed. And now, to be eligible for up to the maximum SSI benefit, a person does not have to pay for food at all. And for their housing, they only have to pay an amount that's equal to 1/3 of the maximum SSI benefit plus $20. And one of the earlier slides did mention that amount. This year, that amount is $342.33 a month. Now, you can have a simple rental agreement if your son or daughter lives with you. You can go ahead and enter into a rental agreement that specifies you're charging them that amount or more. You can be free to charge them more than that. And that they're paying it each month. They can pay it out of their SSI. And obviously they can afford to. If they're eligible for $967 a month of SSI, they can easily afford to pay $342.33 a month or more for their housing. So it's much, much easier to qualify for up to the maximum SSI now than it was over a year ago. Now, what about when you're first applying for SSI? Let's say your son or your daughter has no income and they apply for SSI and they must be paying at least $342.33 a month for their housing to qualify for the maximum SSI. But until their SSI gets approved, they can't afford to pay anything. What you can do is tell Social Security that you, the parent, are giving them housing as a loan that they must repay once their SSI is approved and they get back pay. When you apply for SSI, if you're eligible when you apply, let's say it takes a year to get approved, you'll get back pay going back to generally the month after the month in which you applied. So you'll be getting, in this example, 11 months worth of SSI payments in a lump sum. And then each month thereafter, you'd get your regular monthly benefit. With that back pay, that would be used immediately to reimburse the parents for the rent, the housing for that previous year. And so by saying that you're providing housing as a loan that must be repaid, you can enable your son or daughter to qualify for the maximum SSI the entire time, even during the period they were waiting to get SSI and they had no income.
Okay, how is the average lifetime earnings calculated for SSDI? And if both parents contribute to Social Security, will that increase SSDI?
Excellent questions. They're all great questions. So Social Security takes the person's annual earnings, they divide them by 12 months in the year to figure out the monthly amount. They adjust that for inflation. And then they take the average monthly earnings each year, adjusted for inflation, and come up with an average to figure out their lifetime average monthly earnings indexed for inflation. Now, they will drop some of the lowest earnings years. So sometimes having some years when earnings were minimal or non-existent will not hurt the amount of benefit a person can get. But generally, the higher the lifetime average earnings, the higher the SSDI benefit. Bless you. Now, if a person with a disability who's an adult has two parents, both of whom have a work history, when the first parent either starts getting Social Security retirement or SSDI or passes away, the disabled adult child benefit that the son or daughter can receive will be based on that parent's work history. But let's suppose the other parent subsequently starts getting Social Security retirement or SSDI or passes away, and that second parent had a higher lifetime earnings history. What will happen then is Social Security will switch the disabled adult child benefit from being based on the first parent's earnings to being based on the second parent's earnings. So they will always base the benefit on the earnings record that will provide the higher disabled adult child benefit for the son or daughter. And that can change over time. Now, if a parent starts getting Social Security retirement or SSDI, and they have one adult child with a disability, generally, and I'm oversimplifying a bit here, generally the son or daughter will be able to get a disabled adult child benefit in an amount of about half the amount of the parent's benefit. So if the parent gets $2,000 a month Social Security retirement, the son or daughter's disabled adult child benefit will generally be about $1,000 a month. Now, if that parent is deceased, then the disabled adult child benefit will be 75% of the benefit that the parent would be receiving if they were still alive. Okay. So it's not necessarily something you want to advertise to your kids that you're worth more to them dead than alive, but those are the rules.
Okay, a couple of questions about parent retirement.
Mhm.
when the parent retires, what are the chances that the disabled adult child will be approved for SSDI as well? I think you've pretty much answered that. And can you only apply for SSDI after the parent reaches retirement age?
The son or daughter can get the disabled adult child benefit whenever the parent starts getting their Social Security retirement benefit. If the parent starts getting their Social Security retirement early, before full retirement age, they can do it as early as age 62, then the disabled adult child can start getting their benefit then. If the parent waits until full retirement age, which is age 67 for anyone born in 1960 or later, then the son or daughter can start getting their benefit then. If the parent chooses to wait until they're 70 to start getting their Social Security retirement, that's in order to get a higher monthly benefit for the parent, the disabled adult child can start getting their benefit at that point as well. So the disabled adult child can't get the benefit before the parent starts getting their retirement benefit, if the disabled adult child benefit is based on the parent's retirement rather than their disability or death. Now it's a little wonky here though, because the amount of the disabled adult child benefit will be based on half the amount of the parent's Social Security retirement benefit if the parent started getting that benefit at full retirement age. And that complicates things a bit, because if the parent starts getting their Social Security retirement early, like say age 62, the parent's benefit will be less each month. But the disabled adult child will still get a benefit that's equal to about half the amount that the parent would have received if the parent had waited until they were 67 to start getting their retirement benefit. But on the flip side, if the parent waits until they're 70 to start getting Social Security retirement, the parent will get a higher retirement benefit, but their disabled adult child will not. The disabled adult child benefit will still be the same amount as, or would still be about half the amount of Social Security retirement that the parent would have received if they had started getting it at age 67. Okay, so it's rather confusing, and I apologize for that. I'm not sure I can explain it any better than that. So the big issue here is parents contact me often and ask, should I delay getting my Social Security retirement in order to get a higher monthly benefit? And my answer is, well, you have to weigh the pros and cons. If you wait until you're 70 to get your benefit, your retirement benefit will be higher. But your son or daughter, if they're disabled, will get the same benefit amount that they would have if you started getting your retirement benefit when you were 67. But they can't get that benefit until you start getting your retirement benefit. So your son or daughter would be missing out on essentially 3 years worth of their benefit. So you kind of have to do the math.
Okay, hearing impairment, is that on the disability, one of the disability categories?
It is. If you go to the listing of impairments, which is linked in one of the slides, one of the body systems is listed as special senses and speech, and that's hearing, vision, and speech disabilities.
Okay, the next one, does eligibility from DDA count as proof for medical or school records?
Unfortunately, it does not. No.
Hmm.
DDA can find someone eligible. That means nothing to Social Security. However, documentation uh, like psychological or psychiatric evaluations, vision exams, hearing exams that were provided to establish DDA eligibility, those same records can be used to help establish eligibility for SSI or SSDI. But simply having been approved by DDA won't accomplish anything for SSI or SSDI.
We in the school system always tell parents to start a portfolio and maintain all of these documents because you will need them more than once.
Absolutely.
The next question is more, this is a, a longer question. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I think this person really would have to reach out. But if there's a federal employee who took early retirement, voluntary early retirement, and ultimately at 62 will receive benefits from the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund, not directly from SSA. Should their child, once they turn 18, apply for SSDI or SSI?
Okay. Yeah, another good question, and it gets a bit complicated. Federal employees who started employment uh, in the early 80s, I think around 1983, were entered into a system called the Federal Employees Retirement System, FERS, FERS for short. And under that system, they could get a retirement benefit based on their federal employment, but they could also get Social Security benefits because they were paying into Social Security. However, federal employees who started employment before about 1983, don't quote me on that exact year, I'm not certain, I think it was 83, were in a different system called the Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS. That was a very different system where they paid only into retirement system for federal employees. They did not pay Social Security taxes on their earnings. So those workers were not eligible for Social Security benefits. So, so you'd need to know whether you're in the CSRS or FERS, FERS system to determine whether the federal worker could qualify for Social Security retirement or Social Security disability, and therefore whether their disabled adult child could qualify for Social Security disability based on their record. So if a federal employee or a federal retiree has a son or daughter who's 18, if the federal employee or former federal employee paid into the FERS system, which means they were also paying into Social Security, then they may be eligible for Social Security retirement. And when they apply, they can also apply for the disabled adult child benefit for their son or daughter. However, if they were in the civil service retirement system, they would not be able to get a Social Security benefit and their son or daughter could not get a disabled adult child benefit on their record. Now, that's oversimplified a little bit. Sometimes there may have been former federal employees who were in the civil service retirement system, but who also had a work history outside of federal employment where they did pay Social Security tax, and they may have become eligible for Social Security benefits based on that employment. Or they may have started out in the civil service retirement system and then switched to the federal employees retirement system, FERS, and then they could be eligible for Social Security. So I apologize for the long-winded answer, but the rules are long-winded.
Are there specific forms that families should be looking for to have their medical providers fill out? Or should they collect copies of everything or wait for Social Security or, to reach out to the medical provider directly?
Okay. I did speak about this briefly earlier, but it's a great point to reinforce. So thank you for the question. It's always a good idea to try to gather as much recent medical and school records as you can that would establish the nature and severity of your family member's disability. It's better to gather those records yourself and submit them to Social Security or to Disability Determination Services, DDS, that we talked about earlier, rather than waiting for Social Security to request those records from the medical providers, the school, et cetera. If Social Security requests the records, that can delay the process sometimes by months, and sometimes they won't receive all the necessary records, and that can delay things even further because then Disability Determination Services will need to schedule a new medical evaluation, which may be of dubious quality. So it's always a good idea to gather your own evidence, your own medical and school records. Always probably the best thing you can do.
Is there a time limit on those records specifically? And I think this is specific to a psychological assessment that is 5 or more years old for a permanent condition. Will that kind of trigger the need for an updated psychological assessment?
Generally, a psychological assessment is considered current if it's from within the past year. And the most recent records are the most valuable. However, if your family member has a long-standing disability that began at birth or early childhood, and you maybe provide some older psychological evaluations, particularly if they show that the disability has either been pretty consistent over time, or perhaps if the disability has progressed, has become more severe over time, that can be helpful. But the most important records are going to be the most recent ones, and generally, you want to be sure that as many of them as possible are from within the past year.
This next question is about the appeal process. So if you miss an appeal deadline or you're unable to make a second appeal date, do you have any recourse, or do you just go and start the application process all over again?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to answer it again, unfortunately, in a rather lengthy way. But I want you to have all the details you need. So when you appeal a denial, again, that first level of appeal is called a request for reconsideration. as I mentioned earlier, and it appears on one of the slides, the deadline, the usual deadline for requesting reconsideration is 60 days after receiving the denial letter. And more accurately, it should say 65 days after the date on that letter. They assume that it will take 5 days after the date on the letter for you to get the letter. If you miss that deadline and you have good cause, you didn't get the letter, illness, death in the family, some other compelling reason that you were unable to request the appeal, request reconsideration by the usual deadline, you can submit that explanation of good cause for late filing, for appealing late. And Social Security may agree to accept the appeal late for good cause. Now, there is another alternative. This is a little known trick of the trade. If you miss the appeal deadline and you can't provide adequate good cause for filing it late, that will satisfy Social Security, there's an alternative called reopening. Reopening is kind of a less formal alternative to an appeal. And reopening says, if the original decision was incorrect, it can be reopened for any reason within a year after the date on the letter, on the denial letter. And it can be reopened if it's an SSI decision. It can be reopened for good cause within 2 years after the date on the denial letter. And for SSDI, it can be reopened for good cause up to 4 years after the date on the letter. So the deadlines for reopening are much longer than the appeal deadlines. But it's best to request reconsideration to appeal by the deadline, if at all possible.
Does CDB fall under SSI or SSDI?
Okay. CDB stands for Childhood Disability Benefit. That is the newer name for a benefit that was historically known as Disabled Adult Child, DAC or DAC for short. And most people still refer to that benefit as DAC. That is a type of Social Security disability insurance, SSDI. So it falls under SSDI rather than SSI. CDB or DAC is the SSDI that a person receives on their parents' record.
Okay. Does a parent need to wait until a child is 18 to open an SSA account?
No, I believe they can be open for a child as well, particularly if the child receives SSI. If the child does not receive any benefits, I'm not sure there would be much point in opening the My Social Security account if they're under 18, but I believe they could still do it.
Okay. If a child briefly received SSI benefits as a child, when they try to reapply as an adult, can they do that online, or do they have to do it in person or over the phone?
Yeah, good question. One of the criteria for being able to apply for SSI online is you must not have applied for or received SSI in the past. So in that example, the person received SSI in the past, wanted to reapply for SSI now, they would need to schedule a phone appointment to apply. They could not do it online. But if the person had received SSI in the past, and now they want to apply for SSDI, you can always apply for SSDI online.
If an adult child has a condition listed by SSA as among compassionate allowance guidelines, is there anything special you should do when applying to SSI or SSDI?
Yeah. Social Security has a list of disabilities, of specific medical conditions, on a list called compassionate allowances, which means if you have one of those diagnoses, they assume that it's extremely likely you will be eligible for SSI or SSDI. And if you have a disability that's on the list of compassionate allowances, Social Security should note that based on the diagnosis, but it wouldn't hurt to bring it to their attention to specify, I understand my disability is on the list of compassionate allowances. And what that does is it speeds up the review process, particularly the disability determination, makes it quicker and easier to be approved. So it is a good idea. You can go on Social Security's website, go to the search field and type in compassionate allowances and find a list of all the conditions that are that provide compassionate allowance.
If a child is receiving SSDI benefits due to a parent being disabled and receiving SSDI, when should they consider switching over to SSI? When he turns 18 or when he graduates from high school?
Okay. Trying to think of the most concise, least confusing way to answer this question. It sounds from the question as if the questioner is asking about a benefit that a child under age 18 is receiving on their parents' record. So I want to talk about that kind of benefit. That is called a child's benefit. It's similar to the disabled adult child benefit that we've been talking about, except it's for children under age 18 or under age 19 if they're still in high school. Like the disabled adult child benefit, it's based on the parent's record. The parent has to be either getting Social Security retirement or SSDI or be deceased. The benefit amount is the same for the child as if they were getting the disabled adult child benefit. And for a child's benefit, the child does not have to be disabled. But suppose a child is receiving a child's benefit. Maybe they have a parent who died young and the child is under age 18 and they're getting the child's benefit. And then the child turns 18 or they turn 19 if they're still in high school and they're no longer eligible for the child's benefit. If the child is not disabled, they won't be eligible for any further benefits on the parent's record. However, if the child, now an adult, is disabled, then they could transition from a child's benefit to a disabled adult child's benefit. And they can apply for that benefit as early as age 17 and a half, although they can't be eligible for it until they're at least 18. So it's kind of nice because it gives them 6 months before they could be eligible to get the application process rolling. So I'm not sure if I answered the question there. There was a reference to SSI in that question. If the child were eligible for a disabled adult child benefit, they usually would not qualify for any SSI unless the disabled adult child benefit or the child's benefit, if they're under 18, were less than $987 a month. If it were less than that amount, then they could potentially qualify for a partial SSI benefit. And I see Melissa about to call time. About 4 minutes left.
Can we ask one more question? This actually is a very general one. So the question, can you add documents? If you've already started the application process, can you add additional documents?
Absolutely.
There you go. That's an easy
Absolutely.
one.
And in fact, because there's going to be probably a substantial wait between when you apply and when your application arrives at DDS, Disability Determination Services. Again, they're the state agency that does the disability evaluation. When you, following one of the slides, call DDS and then contact the disability examiner, that's probably the best time to add additional documentation if you have it, and establish a relationship with them to make sure that you provide as much evidence as you can to make it easier for them to approve the application.
Okay, great. I also am putting my email on the chat, so that way if anybody has any specific questions or anything that wasn't answered, you can send it to me and I can share with Michael and see if he can come up with some answers and then I can share it. So all right, so thank you so much, Michael. You're always so amazing, so informative. And then just a reminder, I will send out the slides and the recordings on Friday to all participants, but you'll also be able to view the recordings on the PCR website. It's under transition times. Looking ahead, our virtual transition times meetings will be held once a month from now until June. All meetings will continue to be offered with simultaneous ASL in Spanish and archived on the PCR website. However, next month is a special in-person adult services night at Richard Montgomery High School cafeteria. There is no registration required for this meeting. Come learn about the role of the coordinator of community services in the TY process, and families will have a chance to speak with DDA provider agencies. And this is Wednesday, October 22nd. All right. Thank you so much and
Melissa,
have a wonderful evening.
I'm sorry, Melissa, if I could add just one more point.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I am not able to take referrals for individual consultations any longer. However, Melissa has information about two of my excellent colleagues who can be contacted for individual private pay consultations if you'd like.
Perfect. Michael, can you share that information with me again?
Sure, I will.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. This is excellent.
Yes. All right, everyone. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening. And we hope to see you in October. And if not then, November. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, our interpreters. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.